știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul deplin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. самых окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Страна моя родная, слава мне, повторили. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Страна моя родная, слава мне, повторили. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, слава мне, повторили. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек.
что рабочий и сам. И так как все мы люди, то должны мы, извините, что-то есть. Хотят накормить нас пустой болтовней, чертям спасибо за честь. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как ты рабочий, то не жди, что нам поможет другой. Себе мы свободу добудем твою своей рабочей рукой. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, встать ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. In der Arbeiter Einheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Reitet ein in der Arbeiter Einheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Sretna pod słońcem, rasti u jaslama dzieci, rasti i cvietaj zemljoradnih ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napučini i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjeta
пустяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 30th of November, 2025. And if that sounds like the future to you, well, welcome along. The years seem to fly by, but the days seem to drag sometimes. Now, welcome to the latest live stream. We are going to be looking at a few things tonight, checking in on some, shall we say, ongoing situations, including the Venezuela crisis. What is the latest from there? The resignation or apparent resignation of Andrei Yermak from the presidential administration of Ukraine. The swirling vortex of chaos that is now known as the Your Party conference in Liverpool. And of course, the ever popular responding to viewers' questions. So I'll be taking a few questions from the chat tonight. So if you have anything, do be sure to throw it in there. So first things first, be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. You can see we're doing pretty damn well on the on X, which is good. So be sure to share and share alike. Now, first thing up tonight is the latest from Venezuela. Now, this has now been rumbling on for well over a month, and the US has been moving into place various different naval and air assets and special forces assets into the various different countries it controls in the Caribbean, including on Trinidad. And they've been moving in place various aircraft carriers, various different missile capable ships that could presumably target areas inside Venezuela. They've now declared, or Trump has declared, Venezuela to be a no-fly zone, which and then invaded Venezuela's airspace with American warplanes. Now, this has led to renewed speculation that some kind of military action is imminent. But this was after speculation a couple of days ago that essentially Trump was looking for a deal with Maduro. So this, to me, seems like another case of the US imperialists trying the same thing, but with more aggressive tactics. Let's just go back to the beginning here and look at what the aims of US imperialism are. The aims of US imperialism, ever since the 2002 failed coup against Chavez, has been to derail the Bolivarian revolutionary process. And they have tried various different ways to do this. The more direct and blunt way with a coup that was, of course, sponsored by the US during the Bush administration. They have tried sanctions. They have tried sponsoring opposition politicians. They have tried color revolution type events. They have tried declaring somebody else to be president in the form of the ludicrous figure of Juan Guaido. Where's he these days? I'm not sure. And now they're trying this. And what is the aim of this? Again, we have to ask the question. So always when looking at military aggression, we have to start off with an analysis of the political. So what is the political aim of the Trump administration? Well, the same as all the administrations dating back to George W. Bush. So, but what are the capabilities of the US imperialists? Are they actually capable of doing something, the kind of operations that Smedley Butler used to do back in the 1900s, of sending an expeditionary force up the river, dropping off a few guys in Caracas, killing or deposing Maduro, sticking Machado in there, or finding Juan Guaido again, wherever he's gone, and declaring somebody else to be president? Can they do that? The answer is no, they can't. They are unable to do it. Venezuela is too big. The strength of the revolutionary process is too strongly embedded within the masses. That is, the Bolivarian revolutionary movement is too popular amongst the working class and the peasantry, and the government is too popular to actually stir up some kind of major domestic revolt. What is the US capable of launching the kind of invasion that would have a chance of success? The answer is no, they can't. They can't do that. They don't have the necessary manpower to invade a country like Venezuela, which has not only a strong military, but also strong paramilitary forces and an armed and currently undergoing intensive training civilian militia. And as Marius points out in the chat, that's 500,000 Venezuelan regulars, to a total of 16,000 US Marines and soldiers. That's not enough. None of that is enough. You can have all the aircraft carriers you like floating around in the Caribbean. You can have all the air power you like out there. It's still not enough to actually secure a country. You need a ground force, and they don't have one. So what all of this pressure has been designed to do isn't actually to prepare the way for an invasion. This declaring Venezuela to be a no-fly zone, that's just the latest in a series of shall we say, aggressive bluffs that the Trump administration has been using. What they want more than anything else is to cause an internal collapse inside Venezuela itself. That's what their aim is. They want to either, as they did in Bolivia, pay off some general and secure his services and get part of the Venezuelan military to split away and come over to their side. So far, thankfully, that hasn't happened because Chavez and Maduro were very careful to purge the military of disloyal elements and get rid of the old style officer corps. The other thing is that the other thing that they're hoping is that the pressure that they're exerting will cause potentially a palace coup. Maybe some ambitious government minister or official will think that, well, if I get rid of Maduro, I can take over and the US will do a deal with me. That hasn't happened. Maybe they were hoping to trigger some kind of uprising. In reality, between this and the mass arming of the working class and peasantry in Venezuela, they have consolidated the masses behind the PSUV even more than they were already. So this transparent attempt at pressuring the Venezuelan population and the military hierarchy, the intelligence hierarchy, and the political hierarchy to somehow develop some kind of split, this isn't working. So declaring a no-fly zone is the latest gambit from Trump, and that won't work either. See, the Venezuelans aren't stupid. They've been observing the US for a number of years. They observed the US's severe limitations when it came to the war with Iran. Iran won that war. The US and Israel had to cry off, basically. Trump bombed a largely abandoned site and declared that he obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. Wasn't true. Many observers who know something about Iran have analyzed this since then, and it has been correctly stated by many people now that the strikes on that facility were theatrics. Now, so what is Trump aiming for here? He's probably been told by, I don't know, Narco Rubio or Elliot Abrams or some other ghoul from the depths of the State Department that, well, if we just keep the pressure up, Mr. President, then Maduro will fall. And it won't happen. So what Trump is going to be left with is he's going to be looking very weak and very foolish, because what the Venezuelan government know very well is that if they stand strong and unified for long enough, eventually Trump will get bored and the US will have to move on, declare victory and move on. Incidentally, Trump's just freed the former Honduran president, a narco trafficking scumbag who was imprisoned by a previous U.S. administration. This guy called Juan Orlando Hernandez, who made drug trafficking into a national industry in Honduras. So clearly, it's not about drugs getting into the United States, because this guy was involved in getting drugs into the United States. So all the rationale, all the very flimsy rationales which Trump has offered, are all blown out of the water, quite literally. And he's even U.S. military officials feel a bit queasy about the kind of like piracy that Trump and Hegseth have been engaged in. So this is a non-starter, basically. This is another pathetic attempt to generate some kind of internal split. I don't think it will happen. Also, it is worth noting that the Russians have been consistently very committed to the defense of their Venezuelan ally. In the previous iteration of the Trump administration, the Russians sent a nuclear-capable bomber to Venezuela for exercises. Apparently now there have been Russian personnel of some kind in Venezuela for months now. In fact, the Russians have had an unofficial military presence there for quite a number of years. I believe they also provided security for Maduro for a while and trained new bodyguard units for him. So they've had a presence there for quite some time. They apparently have been helping to modernize the Venezuelan armed forces. But it should be said, no matter what the Russians and the Chinese do, the principal defense of Venezuela are the Venezuelan masses and the Venezuelan armed forces and the patriotic elements within Venezuela. If they all stand strong, there's nothing Trump can do. So even on this no-fly zone, so assume that they stop the Venezuelan civilian airliners or other civilian air traffic coming into Venezuela. Well, how long are they going to keep that up? I mean, this is what are they going to? How long are they going to keep up with this game of chicken? Because eventually, somebody's going to fly in there. Then what? The U.S. is going to do another Iranian airlines attack. Remember where the USS Vincennes shot down an Iranian civilian airliner. Then they tried to use the excuse that it was like fog of war stuff because the Iran-Iraq war was still raging. So if I wouldn't put it past the Trump administration to shoot down a civilian airliner, to be completely honest. But what this reveals and what this has sort of laid bare again before the world is like, and this is the reason why you could regard Trump as having certain positives for our side, is that he's just revealing how crude and piratical and gangsterish the U.S. administration actually is. They haven't even bothered with the flimsy excuses that Biden or Obama or George W. Bush would have used. It's literally just do what we say or we'll kill you, which is a much more honest approach. But it's an approach which is going to pull the wool off the eyes of many people, and ultimately it's not going to work because I think that the Venezuelan government will stay the course. Trump will have been promised that something will happen, and then something won't happen, and then Trump will declare victory and move on. My suspicion is that there will be some kind of bargain being offered under the table. That ultimately there will be some kind of unofficial agreement not signed, where Trump gets to claim victory and walk away, declare that the entire operation was a glorious success. America has never been stronger. We are the strongest nation that has ever existed due to my unique policy of chaos and incompetence. And they'll move on. Not before they try several different provocations, though. And I think we would be very foolish to rule out them trying something like an assassination or sabotage of economic and military targets. The far more likely outcome is that they will do terrorist attacks on the oil industry, terrorist attacks on military installations, try and assassinate political personnel up to and including Maduro himself. There have been assassination attempts on Maduro. Maybe that's why the Russians were involved in retraining his security apparatus. But ultimately, this is going to lead to just an embarrassing failure. The coups all failed. The color revolutions failed. Juan Guaido failed. And when the supposed successor that they have in mind, Maria Machado, is going on like American, like Trumpite podcasts and saying, yes, invaders, and then we will sell you all of our oil industry. Even if you're no fan of the PSUV, if that's the successor that the US wants to appoint, nobody other than the worst compradors is going to be up for that. You know, they have found somebody so lacking in credibility, so obviously a stooge, that even people who aren't particularly fond of Maduro or the PSUV aren't going to accept her. So this is a clown show. This is a case of Trump believing that all he's got to do is basically wave his dick around and everybody will be impressed, and nobody is. And also, the Venezuelans aren't, again, they're not stupid. They have analyzed US military weaknesses. They have analyzed the fact that the US couldn't beat the Yemenis. The Yemenis remained united behind Ansar Allah, and the US couldn't bomb them into submission. The US couldn't beat Iran. And the big weakness of the US is, of course, it can't deploy its own men in large numbers because they're terrified of large casualties. Now, in the large casualty event, if one happened, would be, you know, a sword that swung both ways, which is that on the one hand, there would be a rallying around the flag moment attempted, but on the other hand, it wouldn't last too long, and most American political leaders now are so despised by their own population that they would not really do it. The rallying around the flag wouldn't last too long, and the recriminations would begin shortly afterwards. Bottom line is, the US can't fight a major war. This is why, as we covered on a recent episode of Decline and Fall, they're looking for Filipino mercenaries to plug the manpower gaps in Ukraine. They're sending out adverts to in the Philippines saying that any previously employed soldier or police officer or paramilitary in the Philippines can get $5,000 a month if he goes to Ukraine. Does that look like an empire that can fight its own wars? And when it came to Taiwan as well, they're trying to get the Taiwanese to stage provocations, maybe with the backing of the Japanese, maybe with the backing of the Australians. But they don't want to risk their own men. The moment that the imperialists risk large numbers of their own men is the moment that the internal stability of the United States collapses, because the tacit agreement has been for a long time now between the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie in the United States, and this is an important thing to bear in mind, that the imperial wars will be waged, but they won't be doing the draft. They won't be calling up the sons and maybe even the daughters of the petty bourgeoisie en masse, which is they don't really, the American petty bourgeois don't really give a fuck about the American proletariat or the American lumpens being called up to die in vast numbers, but they do care about their own status, and they do care about their own offspring, and they don't want to get the draft letters coming down hitting the doors. And this is one of the big takeaways that the US ruling class had from the Vietnam War, which is that there was a revolt even amongst the youth of the petty bourgeois. And if they try and just do a draft of the American working class, well, that'll create explosive results as well. There'll be a burst of class war education break out there. So none of these things are viable options for the US ruling class. See, their business model is broken, and they don't know how to refresh it, shall we say? So the Venezuelans, of course, should remain on guard, and we should all remain on guard as well. And here I'll just move to the political organizations, the political organization that we can do and should do. Now, I'm, of course, in the land known as the United Kingdom, Perfidious Albion for short. I'm in Scotland, of course, but what we should all do, all of us who dwell within the NATO countries, is when we're faced with this blatant gangsterism, such as what Trump's trying to do to Venezuela, we need to renew our demands to dismantle NATO, dismantle the US's military outposts across our own country. So if you're in Britain, if you're in Germany, Italy, Spain, then the demand needs to be raised very clearly, and it's not raised clearly enough, because the anti-war movement in this country is dominated by watery pacifist jokers. The demand needs to be raised, whether it's about Venezuela, whether it's about Palestine, whether it's about the Ukraine, is that NATO needs to be dismantled, and the US military presence in Europe needs to be withdrawn. And more than that, we can throw in that the EU needs to be dismantled as well. But if we get rid of NATO, the EU will swiftly follow. And if you're in this country, then we need to demand that not only do we get rid of the US military bases and we get ourselves out of NATO. So I mean that demand needs to be raised everywhere. It's not, we can't just walk around calling for peace and singing Kumbaya. It needs a more militant program. So we need to demand the end of NATO. We need to demand that the pirate government in Britain gives Venezuela its gold back. We need to demand an end to all sanctions that are placed by Britain on Venezuela, on Cuba, or on the DPRK, for instance, and on Russia as well. We need to clearly say to people that the sanctions regimes waged by the British government have nothing to do with our interests. They have everything to do with the interests of the tiny and vampiric British ruling class. So we need to make clear demands about this when it comes to any US aggression that, of course, the British are riding side saddle with. We need to demand the dismantling of the US empire. And Americans need to do this too. Americans, and I've seen like credit to the ACP for taking the correct line on this. What we need to do is make it clear to like American workers, and I think many will know this, but it needs to be made absolutely clear that these wars are in the interests of the people who you correctly identify as your enemies. It's in the interests of Wall Street. It's in the interests of the cabal of political parasites in Washington, D.C. It's in the interest, the war against Venezuela would actually be in the interests of drug dealers, of drug traffickers. Just as the mooted aggression against Mexico would be in the interests of drug traffickers, drug dealers, etc. So it needs to be made clear to the American worker that this is this gangster regime, that this permanent regime that exists in Washington, D.C. Doesn't matter whether it's a donkey or an elephant that's in the White House. What needs to be comprehensively exposed is the fact that this is an unchanging regime which wages permanent wars of aggression overseas and a hyper-aggressive class war at home. And the war overseas, the war against Venezuela, the mooted war against Venezuela, the aggression against Iran, Russia, China, none of that is in the interests of the American worker. The American worker has an interest in good relations with all peoples all the way around the world to work together to develop all of our countries. But the wars are waged in the interests of a tiny and vampiric clique who needs to be destroyed. And that point needs to be made forcibly and repeatedly. So moving on then, and I'll come to comments in a minute. Good evening to all those who have joined us on YouTube and Rumble and Twitch. We have a good number also watching on X. Very good numbers on X. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We get to, of course, the fate of Andrei Yermak. If you're not familiar with who Andrei Yermak is, he was the longtime chief of staff, head of the office of the president for Zelensky in Ukraine. He was very much rumored to be the man who was really in charge of the Ukrainian state, if indeed anybody other than the US and the British were. That Yermak was the guy who was ultimately the power in Bankova, in the presidential administration there, and he has resigned following allegations of corruption. Now, you know, the laughable thing about this is, you alleging that a Ukrainian politician is corrupt is like going outside when it's raining and saying, "Oh, it's wet." It's stating the absolute obvious. Yermak is most likely very corrupt, as is Zelensky. Zelensky was revealed to have a series of offshore accounts and offshore properties by various leaks that happened as far back as 2019 with the Panama Papers, I believe. And Yermak is sort of part political boss, part bagman, very seedy, corrupt figure, and has been one of the driving forces of the war. He has resigned again following an investigation into him by US-controlled so-called anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine. So why has all of this happened now is the interesting question. Well, this is all happening now because there is a very real dispute within US and European ruling circles as to what the hell are they going to do now, because things are going extremely badly on the battlefield. To summarize what's happened in the last few days and weeks, We saw the Russians take Pokrovsk. We see that the Russians are starting advances again into the Kharkov region again. They've been moving around into Zaporozhye and Kherson again. They're clearly preparing for something much bigger down there. The Russians have been bombarding the Ukrainian energy grid to the point where, or it looks like they want to get it to the point where it'll be on the edge of collapse and that they can push it into collapse very easily. So all of this is combined together with the undoubted now massive Ukrainian losses, which even The Economist is having to admit to in its articles, even though they're balancing it by saying the Russians have lost many, many men, but they're then having to admit that Ukraine is running out of men. That's why they're trying to recruit Filipino mercenaries now. So the situation on the battlefield is bad. Ukrainian armed forces are ground down following like 3 years now of relentless attritional warfare waged by the Russians. This has caused another panic in the ruling circles of Europe and perfidious Albion and the US, because there is a real conflict inside the political hierarchy in the United States as to what they're going to do. Some of them, in fact, the bulk of Congress, it seems, wants to continue the war one way or the other. There is a minority opinion represented arguably by the likes of Vance in the administration, who wants to find a way out, basically. And it should be stated that they don't just want to up sticks and quit. So they don't want the US to be seen to be defeated. Just as in Venezuela, eventually they'll find some way of declaring that they've won, even though they won't have. So they want to try and look as if they haven't lost. And the Europeans and the British in particular are desperate to preserve the Kiev regime in some form or another. The problem with that is that that's something that isn't actually acceptable to the Russians. That's not something which that's a bit of a non-starter. Putin made it clear in his recent press conference in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan that the 28-point plan and the 19-point plan, these are things that haven't been properly discussed. Like the 28-point plan that the US was talking about, these represented sort of broad areas for future discussion that had come out of the Alaska summit. They didn't represent a coherent agreement. And now the Europeans have knocked out 9 of these, to knocked it down to 19 points, and they're insisting that the Ukrainians should have an army of 800,000 men. Where they're going to find them is an interesting question. That these are all things which are unacceptable to the Russians, and they're meant to be unacceptable as well. Just as when that blithering idiot Macron said that he's ready to deploy forces in the event of a ceasefire, he's not that stupid. Well, maybe he is, but the people in the French intelligence services and the military aren't that stupid. They know very well that the Russians won't agree to that. And this is meant to train wreck any negotiation. So then the question comes back to, is the Trump administration prepared to turn around to the Europeans and say, right, you fuck off, we're cutting Ukraine off, it's all over? And the answer is no. No, they won't do it. They're trying to persuade. This is the reason why NABU, the anti-corruption agency, which is basically kept there as a means by which the US can intimidate the very corrupt Ukrainian political class, because at any time they can declare an investigation into them. That's why Zelensky tried to get rid of it and failed. They're trying to get the Ukrainians to essentially agree to freeze the lines of conflict where they are now, and maybe give up the rest of Donbass. But again, there are different voices coming out of Washington talking to different factions in Ukraine. Trump, let's assume for the purposes of argument that Trump does actually want to end this. Well, there's elements in his own administration, like Mike Waltz and people like that, who don't want to end it. There's certainly a very strong body of opinion in Congress on the Democrat and Republican side who don't want to end it. So again, is Trump prepared to face down domestic opposition? No, he's not, because Trump's a very, very weak man who is almost completely and utterly controlled by the Republican Party machinery. It's all that MAGA is now is just Mitch McConnell in a MAGA hat. That's it. There's no significant difference between like a Trump administration policy-wise and what a Jeb Bush administration would have been. That was true in the first term as well, by the way. It wasn't that much difference. Or a Marco Rubio presidency would have been. There's no real difference. MAGA doesn't exist. I mean, there's a reason why, like, the ones who might have actually believed in it, such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, are ducking out and running because they've realized that, you know, this is fucked and they better get out while the going's good. So there is no prospect of Trump facing down his internal critics. The Democrats are completely cynical swines, and they will, of course, wave the Ukrainian flag as hard as possible and declare that they must stand with the poor Ukrainians and Trump's a Putin puppet, etc., etc. All in the plan being that they just want to keep the war going at all costs. The costs mainly being paid, of course, by the poor Ukrainians. So this is where things stand. Like, the Trump administration's so-called peace efforts are a joke. They have not been negotiating with the Russians. They have been negotiating with themselves, and they've come up with this random list of points, which apparently Vitkov, Trump's old real estate friend, and he's a pallid weirdo son-in-law, Jared, are going to go to Moscow and deliver these points of supposed agreement to them, and basically try and get them to agree to them. It won't work, because the thing that nobody pays any attention to, is certainly in the bourgeois press, is that there's no prospect of the Russians agreeing to this kind of shitty deal, which leaves the Kiev regime in place, because the Russians have lost nowhere near the same amount of men as the Ukrainians. I mean, according to the Media Zona and BBC project, the casualties are around about 140,000 for the Russians, over 1 million for the Ukrainians. But even if the Russians have lost considerably fewer men, that's still a lot of men. That's still like if I get this right, that's more men than were lost for the Soviet Union in the Afghan war, for sure. Correct me, Russian viewers, if I'm wrong about that. I think this is the worst casualties endured by Russia in warfare since the Great Patriotic War itself. So this is might not be as bad as the Ukrainians, and the Russians might have a higher population, but this is still a very significant amount of dead. And if the Russian population sees the bourgeois faction, the comprador faction in Moscow trying to do a rotten deal, well, then, you know, Putin's and united Russia's position will suffer. So there is internal pressure on the Putin administration as well. That means that even if the bourgeois faction in the Russian government would love to cut a shit deal and restore relations and go back to, you know, moving their loot into British banks, well, they might not be able to. In fact, I'm pretty damn sure they won't be able to. So this will, in a week's time, we'll come back here again, and we'll look at another complete fuck up from the Trump administration. There will be, and Trump will be going, Putin, I thought I knew him. Turns out, bad guy, nasty guy. Who knew? I thought we were friends. We went to Alaska. We were going to have burgers. It's terrible. Killing each other. I want to stop it. I'm going to give Ukraine a tomahawk, you know, and then we'll go in for another round of weapons-based escalations. The other point is that, of course, it's not just in the White House where decisions are made. You'll observe the there were two empty Russian tankers targeted in the Black Sea yesterday, I believe, by sea drones, remote controlled drones that are the speciality, I think, of the British. Now, the British were training a whole unit of Ukrainian naval personnel on the operation of sea drones. That unit, by the way, got wiped out or severely damaged by a Russian bomb attack when they were being awarded medals. And the British Defense Secretary Grant Shapps turned up for that one, though he managed to get away. But it's not, I think it would be foolish to assume that the British didn't restart this project, because one of the things that the British have as one of their key objectives is to try this insane plan to gain dominion over the Black Sea. This is why the British are so obsessed with Crimea. This is why they won't give up on the idea of getting NATO bases there, because this is one of the benefits that the Maidan in 2014 was supposed to bring them. It was supposed to bring them the ability to actually position ships in Crimea and more directly threaten Russia. Of course, the Russian takeover of Crimea kind of eliminated that. But one of the things the British want to do is to put more and more pressure on Russian merchant shipping. And the best way they can do that is by getting the Ukrainians to pilot these sea drones into Russian merchant ships that are in the Black Sea. But whether this will have any long-lasting effect, whether the Ukrainians are capable of doing more than hitting a couple of empty vessels, is in doubt at the moment. Certainly the Russians will take countermeasures. But one of the things we can also expect, if Trump does try by some chance to push for some kind of peace deal, and the usual suspects, that is the British, don't want that to proceed, we can expect more and more attacks than have been seen so far. Unlikely to this whole dance over the so-called peace negotiations is unlikely to lead to anything other than the US then agreeing to give more weaponry to Ukraine, but weaponry it doesn't really have. Now, I just want to pick up on a comment from Svetlana in the chat, who says, "I'm afraid to have to disagree with the number of Russian lost. We have lost far more than we are being told." Now, this leads to an interesting development. Now, there's two. I'll quote the Media Zona figures because that seems to be the most restrained estimate in the West. So the recorded names that they're quoting, and again, bear in mind, this is a project done by the BBC and by the exiled Russian oligarch Khodorkovsky has a role in this. Now, the number of names they have on their website, right, or the number of names they say they've recorded thus far is 149,241 Russian casualties. Now, they have an upper end estimate, which is referred to as their probate registry estimate, of 219,000. So that's their upper end estimate. So that's the unconfirmed number of dead. So again, like that they seem to be the most reliable or sort of realistic to my mind. But if others have different sources of information, I'm more than happy to look at them. But again, we have, and I'm not sure if the Russian government makes public statements on the casualty figures, but if it is the case that the number is more like 219,000, even in a country the size of Russia, you can't hide that. 219,000 is a significant amount of men who have been killed, if indeed it is that high. And if it's higher, and because if the kill ratio is 10-1, and if the Russians have lost upwards of 200,000, then how many of the Ukrainians lost? What are we looking at? What, upwards of 1.5 million to 2 million? It's conceivable. But we won't know the full truth about this until the war is over, I do not think. Right. So moving on then to final item on the agenda before we get into questions and answers. That is, of course, your party, or is it their party? Seems to be theirs more than yours. The most ridiculously named party in British political history has, of course, had its founding conference this weekend, and it immediately dissolved into faction fighting and attempts to exclude various different people. Um, Before the conference even started, there was a series of expulsions of people who were also in the SWP. That's a Trotskyite group renowned for basically damaging anything they touch. But there were also other people expelled who weren't part of any other political party or organization, who were expelled for dubious or unknown reasons. One of the founding MPs quit due to allegations of social conservatism because he wasn't prepared to buy into the transgender bullshit. The co-founder of your party, Zara Sultana, went and stood outside the conference in protest over the expulsions of her own supporters. There's still not an agreement on where all the money is going that Sultana and her group collected when they launched their own membership portal. And within the hall, you got a gaggle of individuals speaking, including like bizarre gender ideology advocates who've been allowed to leave other political parties under a cloud, under a sexually related cloud, or should we say allegations of a sexual nature related cloud, speaking on the stage and declaring, war on the social conservatives, etc. The overall impression was one of complete incoherence, and essentially what it confirmed to me looking at it from the outside is that it is even worse than I suspected. Now let's go through the reasons why. Why is it so chaotic, and why are they throwing people out? Why are they advocating for such like bizarre positions that are only going to alienate people? Now, this is what happens when you try and unite the British left. And because Corbyn has actually united quite a lot of the British left behind him, including a lot of the Trotskyites, who are all still very enthusiastic. I see that the Revolutionary Communist Party are all very enthusiastic about the Corbyn project. Of course they are. Their aim is to shove people towards it. But your party, what its chaotic founding conference proves, is that uniting the left is not something that we should aspire to or actually think is a positive thing. Because you see all these people in the hall, the gender ideology fanatics, the distinctly like anti-working class politics of a lot of these people, the bureaucratic and dictatorial way in which the Corbyn clique wants to run the party. That is the left. That is the British left. It's a whole phalanx of the most unappealing freaks that one can possibly find. And I started noticing this over a decade ago when you got all these people saying if we could just unite the left, if we could just unite everybody together. That's actually, not something which is going to lead to any significant political progress, because the problem isn't uniting the left. First of all, unite them around what? How can you unite with people who are supporters of NATO? How can we unite with people who are Zionists? How can we unite with people who will who are advocates for imperialism? How could we unite with people who are advocates for gender ideology or Malthusian green politics? How can we unite with any of that? How could we go to the working class in good conscience and say this is what we want you to endorse? We want you to get on board with these people. No, because like this thing called the left, which is, again, very well represented by your party, is a toxic dump. It is the British left, for the most part, has been pro-imperialist for decades. It's been in favor of the actions of, tacitly in favor of the actions of British imperialism, or openly in favor of the actions of British imperialism. Your party, by the way, its leadership are supporters of the state of Israel, including Jeremy Corbyn. I would ask everybody to check out his encounter with the woman who asked him if he was an anti-Zionist. He refused to answer that question and was rather patronizing and rude to her. This whole nice guy image that he's cultivated over the years, this is just simply propaganda. He's nice as long as you're supportive of him. You know, if you're somebody who dares to challenge him, then he's a right bastard. And that's true, and be confirmed being true from for people that I've known who have encountered him when he's been running an organization and he's been trying to kick somebody out or sideline them. He's a ruthless bastard when it comes to defending his own privileged position, which is what your party is really all about. It's him and a group of others defending their privileged position as honorable men, women of parliament. So Corbyn won't commit to anti-Zionism because he won't commit to anti-imperialism. Corbyn offers watery pacifism. You know, wring your hands, sign a petition, say it's all very bad and call for an inquiry. That's your anti-war left. And that's Corbyn's politics. Because, and again, I'll choose the most cynical interpretation here because I think it's accurate. It's because Jeremy Corbyn knows what his role is. Jeremy Corbyn understands, and you don't get to be in Parliament for 40 plus years without understanding the role that you're playing. And the role that he is playing is of the official leftist opposition. And it's a loyal opposition, meaning it'll never go too far in imposing what British imperialism wants to do. And if anybody does try and go too far, well, Corbyn will bring the hammer down on them and make sure that they're sidelined in the anti-war movement, and that the anti-war movement and the Palestine solidarity movement will remain largely impotent, something which is largely about marching around London and doing nothing. That's the Jeremy Corbyn politics. It's the kind of anti-war work that the ruling class and the political establishment in Britain will accept. And that's what your party will be. It will be social chauvinism, social imperialism, combined with the worst elements of market-driven identity politics, and, of course, authoritarianism when it comes to actually managing the party itself. It'll be run by bureaucratic clique, dressed up with various sort of fancy-looking so-called pseudo-democratic innovations, but in essence, it'll be run by a tiny clique. And again, there's more and more people now, hearteningly, who have made this correct observation, which is that left politics in this country are essentially run by like a tiny group of London-based individuals. That includes Corbyn and a few of his friends. And again, I would encourage you all, if you haven't watched it already, to go and watch the interview that myself and Kit Clarenberg did with Professor David Miller, where he talks about who these groups are. It's a tiny clique of bourgeois and petty bourgeois types who essentially want to establish themselves as a left opposition. And if you read the material coming out of your party, so much of it is about nasty old Nigel Farage, how big a threat reform are, how the absolute priority is keeping them out. Now, don't get me wrong, Farage is an enemy of the working class. He is an ultra-reactionary. But at the same time, like what Nigel Farage says today, Keir Starmer does tomorrow. So, but this has always been the case with the Labour Party, going all the way back to Enoch Powell. Every time some new racist demagogue gets up and starts screaming about, blame this racial minority group, or blame immigrants as a whole, or, let's have a pogrom. What does the Labour Party do? The Labour Party leaders have always just followed along behind them and started adopting some of the things that sort of their rhetoric and policies informed by them. This happened with the BNP, the British National Party, 20 years ago. This was, the BNP were deliberately elevated by the media, and then the Labour Party moved further and further into an ultra-reactionary, racist political position as a result. The same is being done now. So it's all very well for your party and the people involved with that to say, oh, we got to stop Farage, we got to stop Farage. What they're actually setting up here is something which I've talked about before, but it's worth reiterating, is that they are getting ready ultimately to do some kind of coalition stitch-up deal with whoever succeeds Keir Starmer. Because all that for a lot of these people who are considering voting Green or considering voting for Corbyn's lot, what a lot of them just want is that what they truly want is a Labour Party which is just infinitesimally to the left of where Keir Starmer is, which is led by somebody who's a bit more polished, who can do basically all the same things, but who can nuance it and sell it to them nicer. Keir Starmer's too crude. He's too dumb. He's too ghastly. He's too compromised by his associations with the Israeli genocide and various other things. And of course, he's too compromised by his ties to the intelligence services. So they need a clean skin, somebody who looks a bit better to come in. So that's why, I've said it before, but I think that they ultimately will install Andy Burnham when Starmer is finally disposed of and packed off to the bread benches of the House of Lords. And ultimately, they will get a lot of the votes of the Green people going Green, and the people going to your party will probably come back. And the your party MPs and the Green lot that do get elected next time will be running into a coalition with the Labour Party, the Liberals, and anybody else who comes along to keep out the fascists. And all that will deliver is more attacks on the working class in the name of anti-fascism. So therefore, further disgracing the term anti-fascism. So this is where things are going, and they're not going anywhere good. And I am entirely unsurprised. And just as a note to all of those who keep saying we should unite the left, we should appeal to the people who are joining your party. I don't think we should. To be blunt, I would extend this to the United States as well. If you're in the US, how appealing would it be if suddenly all of the different left groups like the PSL, WWP, DSA, and all the other micro trot groups and pseudo Maoist outfits all suddenly came together and united? What would that look like if you're in the United States? I bet it would look like a right unappealing mess, because the left in the United States is largely a right unappealing, horrific, anti-working class mess. This is what your party is. We don't need to be appealing to the people joining this. Trust me, I've known many people who got excited by Corbyn. Do you know what the limit of their politics was? Joining Corbyn's fan club. And that was it. Now, I know very well that there are a minority of people who go through that and draw radical conclusions. And yes, for those people, an appeal should be made. But we don't appeal to them by pandering to them. We don't appeal to them by saying, oh, yes, Jeremy's right, but we'll do it better. No, we appeal to them by saying, honestly, well, if you're sincere, if you want something to be different, if you realize the need for change, your party is not the vehicle to do it. Because what they're trying to do is to revive social democracy of the mid-20th century, which is totally impossible to revive and undesirable to revive. This is a dead end. So we can be honest with people. We can put forward our critiques. We can say to them, look, this is why this is not going to be, this is why this is a non-starter. You might not agree with us now, but maybe you'll come to agree with us after a year or two. But to compromise and pretend that, that the Saint Jeremy of Islington is anything other than a bankrupt fraud who is conning people. Him and his clique are conning people. They're pretending that things can change in the old parliamentary way. All they want is to sit on the green benches for a few more years and be the honourable gentleman of Parliament. That's all he wants. Why the hell should we pay to sustain him in that position? Why should you get involved with this organization, which is just a jobs for the boys and girls operation for all the people who can't get jobs through the Labour Party anymore? What is the point? The point is that we are faced with a much, much more difficult scenario here. The fact is that the entire Western left, as I've said many times, needs to be tossed into a grave. It is finished, it is over with, and it is completely compromised by its associations with imperialism, with its adoption of reactionary idealism, with its adoption of all the different wretched Malthusian Green Party positions, with all the different anti-human policies that they have followed. This is a dead end. It has no appeal left to the great bulk of the working class, which is who we actually need to appeal to. There's nothing there for us. Let it go, let it sail off and sink. That's the best thing we can do. Right, okay. Okay, so I'm going to go and start looking at comments. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in thus far. Good to have you all with us. So we've got Peep Show 090. Oh, we've got a critic. Javier Burgos says, chaos. I watched the conference with members that voted live on stream. The only chaos is from the entryist and the TERFs, but an expected sin from a CPGB TERF. Well, first of all, an inaccuracy in your comment there, Javier, if indeed that is your real name, which is I can't be a TERF because I'm not actually a feminist. So you could say that I was a trans excluding communist, a tech maybe, but that's an inaccurate term. Second of all, well, we saw some of your favored spokesmen on the platform. Yes, the kind of chaps who let's just say that some of them were caught in. Well, one of them in particular was caught in certain urinary sexual scandals a few years ago, and that might be why he had to leave the Green Party. But you and your fellow gender ideologists have only managed to further drive what's left of British leftism into a ditch, and for that, perhaps I should thank you. Because all you've done really is confirm just how fucked the left is, because they adopted gender ideology lock, stock and barrel over the protests of most of their politically advanced female members, and adopted this bizarre men's rights movement as some kind of revolutionary force. So perhaps we should thank people like you for driving the left further into a ditch. Hello to President Jesus. Hello to Gonzalo and Balkan tourist Walter Stolzing. Hello to Pavel, who says, solidarity from reactionary Austria. I went to the meeting of the local representatives of the communist organized KPO. Is that Communist Party of Austria? They have some good local initiatives about total crap and imperialism and gender psyop. Oh dear. Then, well, it's for you to decide. I can't dictate from here what you should do, but look, if they're not prepared to be, a consistent anti-imperialist force, if they buy into the gender psyop, then there's really not a lot of value to them. They're going to lead workers. Well, any workers that are attracted to them will be led absolutely nowhere. To be completely blunt about it. But again, these are decisions you'll have to make, but it doesn't sound heartening, to say the least. Al666 Tanine, hello to you. Walter Keating, hello to you. Dingo Ate Me Baby on Rumble. Duca Dianibal, 79, hello. Broline, hello to Nikki. Hello to Peter Carmichael. David Ball in New Jersey. In It For Fun, formerly known as Slumbering Colossus. Yes, on the validity of reports that Russia's sent some troops to Venezuela. Well, I think they've had a presence there for quite some time, to be honest. Hello to Callum Roach. Auntie Matt, hello to Svetlana. Luca says, about your party, I think you have been proven correct. This very much looked like the social imperialist left jumping off the Labour ship before it sinks. What will happen now? Oh, it'll go on for a while. It'll go on. It'll go on because it's got a lot. It's got a lot of people in it. But the thing is, like, what will be revealed is just how little value that has. And when Labour changes its leader to be cosmetically better, the pressure will be put on them to a lot of their supporters will sort of start to drift away. Plus, like, I mean, it's conceivable that if there's a bad turn in the economy, that they could pick up more support. But again, like, because of the flawed nature of this thing, which is a party of mid 20th century social democracy, where there's no reforms are possible in this system now, it'll be up like a rocket and down like a stick. It'll end up like Syriza or other reformist operations if it goes anywhere. So it might hang around for a while, but long term it will go nowhere and do nothing. Hello to Pat in Bristol. Hello to who else we got here? Tim Gray, who says, what is disappointing is that so many attach hope to what is clearly a failed political project. Indeed. Right. Hello to Yellow Sheeps, Iman Puedama, Comrade Kais, AJ Williamson, who chose this over Moats. I am quite sincerely flattered. Galloway's been in this game a lot longer than I have, and if you find what I'm doing here to be valuable, then I thank you quite sincerely for it. Thank you quite sincerely for your viewing. And again, be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. Right, hello to Marius, good to see you here. Hello to the Black Pack, and who else we got? Eman says, Trump's pardon of Juan Hernandez while smearing Venezuela as a narco state is great timing. Who says Americans don't get irony? I think Trump still doesn't get irony, to be completely honest. Marius says only 4% of Venezuelans support a U.S. invasion of their country. Even anti-Maduro and anti-Chavista Venezuelans balk at this idea. Yes. And Marius adds, Ecuador is the center of drug trafficking to the U.S. in South America, but it's a pro-U.S. government. Well, of course, look, the U.S. government has never, ever been bothered in the slightest by drug trafficking. Neither has the British one, by the way. Both of their imperial legacies are based on significant amounts of narcotics trafficking, going all the way back to the British Opium Wars waged on the Chinese. Let's us just remember for a second, like the Golden Triangle operation in Southeast Asia, which the CIA was running. The heroin for the French Connection, if you remember that movie of the 70s, came from, based on real events, they came from originally heroin or poppy growing operations and heroin manufacturing that was going on in Thailand and in Vietnam. There's a whole book about it, you know. So this is a well-established fact that the U.S. has engaged in mass drug dealing operations to fund its black operations budget some of the time and to just make people rich. This was how they were funding the Contras in Nicaragua. It's partially why the crack wave of the 1980s took off, again, sponsored by the CIA, thanks to the work of the late Gary Webb, who died in mysterious circumstances. The CIA was exposed as having been heavily involved in and heavily being responsible for the crack dealing epidemic of the 1980s. All that tough on crime shit from like Joe Biden and Bill Clinton was to, if you believe indeed that it was, the purpose of it was indeed to be tough on crime, was to clean up a mess that the CIA and the rest of the American intelligence agencies helped to create in the first place, or are directly responsible for. So it's never been about eliminating the evil of drugs coming into the United States. That's always been a lie. The war on drugs was a lie. It was just a way of locking people up on charges, locking up political opponents of the US regime internally on charges that weren't political. Because what do? You get the drug squad to kick someone's door in. They found like a joint's worth of weed, and they say, 20 years in prison, Your Honor. And just happens to be somebody who was involved in, I don't know, trade union activism, or involved in like black nationalism or something like that. Or the cops just plant it. It's always been a fraud. The war on drugs was always just a justification for vast domestic repression and foreign intervention. That's all it ever was, and that's all it is now. So this is why if we were dealing with a slightly more competent administration, Hernandez would have been quietly freed at some other point in time, not when Trump's literally dancing around saying, "I'm blowing up the narco boats," Fuck's sake, And also, as Abtin points out in the comments, I'll read his comment out. The opium production of Afghanistan magically increased to ludicrous levels right after 2001. A lot of it ended up in Iran and Russia. This is, of course, the mystery as to why this happened. Yeah. They use narcotics as weapons against their enemies. They want to encourage drug addiction in targeted countries. They want to hollow out countries by encouraging drug addiction, alcoholism, prostitution, all of the social vices that we see so prevalent in the imperial core countries. They know damn well that if they help promote them in targeted countries, that it'll weaken them internally. The US is the world's #1 drug dealer, #1 sex trafficker, #1 arms dealer. This is what imperialism does. So Jonathan says, drugs fuel Wall Street up their noses and the drug money into the banks. Very true. Hello to Caustic Grip. Jonathan says, Venezuela has always been open to negotiations, but American neocons are so far up their own asses to do any negotiations. Yeah. So let's just scroll down here. Walter Stolzing says, I've recently heard some speculation that orange groves in Cuba have been attacked using some kind of biological agent, reducing their yield to nothing, basically. Yeah. This is what we know for a fact, thanks to Victoria Nuland, that the US was running bioweapons research in Ukraine. We know that they opened up biolabs when Obama said that they couldn't do that research inside the US anymore. So they offshored it to various different locations, and largely in ex-Soviet bloc countries. And we know that they've been working on all kinds of nasty shit in there to attack crop yields. They've been doing this research for decades. So if they did attack Cuban agriculture using some kind of biological weapon, I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest. That's exactly the sort of shady shit the US would get up to. In fact, a Russian general who was actually looking into the biolabs produced a report a while back. He was, of course, later assassinated, accusing the US essentially of running like a global biological warfare program. No wonder he was assassinated. But all of that report is still out there somewhere. I need to dig it out and have a look at it. Marius says, Alex Jones fully supports going into Venezuela. People don't trust mainstream news anymore. So you've got conspiracy theorist types getting paid to convince people. Yeah. I mean, Alex Jones, that guy's so fucking compromised. It's unbelievable. But like, the guy is like up to his eyeballs in debt, and he's basically owned by Elon Musk. He'll say anything Elon tells him to say, you know. Evola Sunglasses, interesting name, says NATO is the occupation of European civilizations. Both left and right should reject it. Well, you know what? If there's any right wingers out there who are actually genuinely anti-NATO, I've yet to meet one. To be honest, I mean, you get right wingers online. I mean, American right wingers are more likely to reject NATO than European ones are. The European right wingers post World War II have largely been cucks of the US. Like, this is what I mean. They of course, due to their class origins, valued anti-communism more than anything else, and so they were essentially the foot soldiers in the Gladio operations. A lot of them, most of the right wingers who talk who talk a game about being anti-NATO or being anti-Israel, it all generally evaporates as soon as they come into contact with reality. That's certainly the way it's gone over the last few years, anyway. Macron bringing back French conscription. I can't see that working out for French elites. Well, I'm yet to be convinced that the French can actually pull that off. It's this is a French political establishment which is hideously unpopular. I wouldn't be surprised if they tried it. I mean, they had conscription in France, I believe, up to the 90s. So it's not so long ago. But interestingly, Macron, of course, is just young enough to have missed the last conscription wave, I think. Certainly he did. He wasn't conscripted. Also, Sarkozy was old enough but avoided it, just as he avoided prison. But a lot of other French presidents were conscripted, like I think Chirac was in the military, certainly. Mitterrand, of course, was in the civil administration of Vichy, but nobody a lot of people don't like to talk about that one. Right. Alistair Page McGill says there was a story recently about Colombian mercs not even getting the money they were promised and having to run for their lives. Would not be surprised if that actually happened. I mean, if you're looking for doing mercenary work for the US, make sure you get paid up front, because if you die, no money for you, and certainly no money for your family either. And even if you survive, they'll probably try to not pay you as well. Walter Keating says, what will the US ruling class do confronted with their own demise? They would happily burn down the world to save their own skin. These are dangerous times. These are dangerous times. Indeed true. I mean, this is why ultimately I've always said, and will continue to say, that the bringing down imperialism is dependent upon dismantling imperialism inside the imperial core nations. Like, British imperialism will only be vanquished from inside this blighted island of ours. US imperialism will only finally be defeated by a revolt of the masses inside the United States. That's the only way it's going to finally be defeated. And so we can hope, and I hope it's not a fool's hope, that there is of course, there is building anger towards the establishment in the United States. But if it breaks out to the degree that the US ruling class is faced with a domestic revolt, that might be one of the things that can restrain them from doing something drastic. But I think we need to also be realistic about their ability to do drastic stuff. They are faced with a situation where any move they make is likely to trigger further domestic revolt, which they're desperate to avoid. Fear of that will also keep them from doing anything drastic. And I also think we should never get paralyzed with fear as to what our enemies are going to do. The mid 20th century CPSU was guilty of that, of boosting fear of nuclear war in order to justify their own capitulation. So we shouldn't engage in that. But to reiterate the point, domestic revolt against the US ruling class is the best solution for the ending of this. Multipolarism doesn't end US imperialism. Only really in the end, a revolt of the US working class will do that. The Stop the War movement didn't even seem to notice Western support for moderate rebels, from what I remember. It's why I never found them very inspiring. Well, they supported, tacitly supported the war in Libya, and they tacitly supported the war in Syria. Because basically the British ruling class learned a lesson, which is deploy Libyan and Syrian exiles to scream at anti-war meetings and say, you can't support the bad dictators. And then you end up with an anti-war movement becoming like pro-regime change. But again, tacitly pro-regime change, which is what happened here, which is why these people can't be trusted to lead anything. Just scrolling through here. Hello to Robert, who greets me from the belly of the beast. Good to see you here. Right. Working Prole Incorporated says American class awareness is deaf. It's minority who are aware what is going on. The rest you can talk to. Hook blue in the face. 40 years neoliberalism has done damage. Yes, true, but things can change very rapidly. I mean, if this AI bubble pops, things will change very rapidly. See our oncoming Crisis of Imperialism episode for more details. Songs 4K says Nabu license oligarch corruption and revoke licenses to steer Ukraine. Yes, well, basically, like in the West itself, like anti-corruption agencies only go after those who have stepped out of line. You've got a license to be as corrupt as fuck if you want, as long as you toe the line, as long as you're useful to those in charge. The day you're not useful or become embarrassing, that's the day they suddenly discover, my God, there's corruption in this establishment. Right. YepX asks, with Christmas coming soon, Merry Christmas, everyone, can you do a special how it should be approached from a proletarian perspective instead of the commercialized bourgeois mentality? Interesting question. Communist Christmas. I'd be interested to know how it was handled in the old USSR, actually. Just let me write this down. Communist Christmas. I'll have a think about that. Just scrolling through here further. Walter Keating, excuse me. Walter Keating says the crisis of legitimacy facing bourgeois politicians all over the West. When that's gone, all that's left is force and violence. Not good, believe me, not good. Well, bad in some senses, positive in others, because again, the more that the ideological machinery breaks down and people just aren't convinced by it anymore, the more they have to come out from behind the curtain and just literally point a gun in your face and say, you must obey, the more damage that does, because it will reach the point where you have to take seriously the claims the system makes for itself. It is ingrained in like the mentality of much of even the working class in Britain, that this is a democracy, of that their votes, that votes, if the voting matters, that there's still a belief that the power of the ballot box means all, or it should mean all. If they just come right out into the open and say, not only does it not, but we're going to put a gun in your face and tell you to go and work in this special economic zone, well, then that is a crisis of legitimacy. Now, what you got to realize is that one of the big things holding the system up isn't brute force in this country, because they don't have the capacity to do, a lot of brute force. Like the police forces in this country aren't that big. They're still not routinely armed. The army is incredibly small. There's no like paramilitary organizations or militias. I know they could probably put those together fairly quick, but the idea that this is a democracy, in inverted commas, that does a lot of work for the ruling class. It really does. And if they give up that illusion, if they just blatantly break with that, that's going to cause an awful lot of problems for them, even amongst the elements of the petty bourgeoisie they like to keep on board. So, though we live in troubled times, there is always we should always bear in mind that the more they drop the mask, the worse it is for them. Yes, many of us will get tossed in jail or worse ultimately, but the more they come out into the open and act like the dictatorship we all know is there underneath, the more damage it will do to them as well. Soviet casualties in Afghanistan were probably around 10 to 15,000, says Almir. So way lower than what has been carried off in Ukraine. Lucas says, about British plans in the Black Sea, are there any links with the regular headlines about Russian boats approaching UK territorial waters as an excuse to justify more naval aggression? Well, the stories I've seen are that like Russian freighters and like Russian naval ships go through the internationally recognized channel in channels in British territorial waters or near British territorial waters. So they'll go through like the English Channel in an international shipping lane, and the British politicians will go, "Oh, Russians," to justify doing stupid shit like this stuff in the Black Sea. I think that what will happen is the Russians might quietly extract some vengeance somewhere, and the British will be told to stop being silly. That may well happen at some point, but it's all lies and bullshit. Things that 10 years ago were completely unremarkable, such as like Russian freighters using internationally recognized sea lanes, will be suddenly presented as an act of aggression. Russian planes flying again in international airspace will be presented as an attack on Britain. Like, why would the Russians actually want to attack Britain? What would they have to gain by doing so? Where's the invasion threat here? It doesn't exist. Right. Sid says largest figure for Ukrainian losses is 1.7 million. That's around about what I've seen, is 1.5 to 1.7 million, possibly dead. Brolin says, how was it determined that Corbyn was called anti-Semitic? It was called anti-Semitic basically by like the Zionist lobby and various petty reactionaries, including many inside the Labour Party itself, basically because he'd had a history with like Palestine solidarity. His position on Israel is actually arguably, in fact, it's a pro-Zionist position because he supports the two-state solution. So like his actual position is like just the position of the declared position of like the US government in reality, which is that or certainly the British government, which is that they support the two-state solution. But the fact that he'd actually had dealings with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and he'd been to speak to meetings in West Asia where he'd drawn attention to certain crimes Israel had committed, that was, of course, too much for the Zionists, who suddenly realized that who wanted to destroy any prospect of like any kind of like even the mild criticisms of Israel becoming more mainstream. In the end, it didn't work because their own actions made criticisms of Israel more mainstream. Caustic Grip says modern left are basically just a bunch of Bundists with an LGBT bend. That's true. Jonathan says watery pacifism is legal Marxism of the 21st century. Yes, that's true. Hello to those of you who just joined us. To President Jesus, who says, isn't the ACP trying to unite with Hassan Piker? Well, I certainly hope not. Hassan the whoremonger is not somebody to be united with. Iman says, if Corbyn's not controlled opposition, he might as well be. It makes a lot of sense if he is, because he doesn't have anything to lose by saying whatever he wants to. Yeah, well, and yet he's become, if anything, even less radical over the years. Duca Dianibal says, any thoughts on the so-called coup in Guinea-Bissau? Maybe for a future broadcast. Yeah, I've had some notifications about that. I haven't looked into it in detail, so I'll have to have a look at it and like come back to you later in the week on that one. Right. Lucas says, I've come to the conclusion that the left is more insidious obstacle to class consciousness than the openly reactionary types on the right. Well, the open reactionaries are a barrier to it in their own way because they spread bullshit amongst the working class. So they are very much a barrier. But the left is more of a problem because it presents itself as an alternative that it just simply is not, and it misleads people just as much as like reactionaries do. Debob says, I heard 2-sentence sound bites from the conference on the radio. Corbyn sounded like a patronizing head teacher. Well, that does track. Formerly Decent says, greetings from the future Socialist Republic of Scotland. We don't need another unionist party up here. Corbyn has nothing to offer, and we've had it up to here with gender woo. Yes, of course, Corbyn very much in favor of gender ideology, and very much in favor of keeping the old British Union together. Now, of course, he won't say that. I mean, infamously, Corbyn got caught up here in Scotland a few years ago now when he was ambushed by supporters of Scottish independence, challenging him over another Scottish independence referendum and the need for one. And what he wouldn't do is he wouldn't answer the question. What he did was he sort of waffled and said, oh, well, it was a once in a lifetime vote, a once in a generation vote, the one in 2014. And now he's saying, well, he won't stand in the way of another Scottish independence referendum, which is easy for him to say because the London government's never going to give the Scottish people one again. And also the SNP isn't going to ask for one either. Because Corbyn could have answered that question honestly rather than waffling around it, which is what he did, and trying to pretend that he's now in favour of this. He could have just said directly that he actually doesn't believe in Scottish independence and that he's a defender of the union of England and Scotland and Wales for reasons that for progressive reasons. He could say that. He could advance an honest position. I mean, for all that I have many criticisms of George Galloway, his position is slightly more honest, or was slightly more honest than Corbyn's. But Corbyn wants to have it both ways. He wants to sort of bring in people who might be in favour of Scottish independence, give them the impression that he's in favour of it. But of course, he's not, because his entire political project depends upon the unity of the British state. But he's not prepared to come out and actually say that. So he adopts this sort of slippery language that much of the soft left adopt over this issue. Moats had Rania Kalak from the PSL on. Well, I imagine that was an edifying experience, to say, or more accurately, an unedifying experience. Right. What else? Who else we got here? E-Man says, I know I shouldn't ask, but I don't suppose you heard about Nick Fuentes suggesting a left-right anti-APAC populist alliance. I don't follow or support Fuentes, but it sounded interesting. Look, Fuentes is a fraud. He's a supporter of a U.S. invasion of Venezuela. He's a supporter of U.S. imperialism. Like, yeah, he's got that. He's, and nominally anti-Israel, but when questioned on it, this tends to evaporate. So he's a complete fraud, and nothing that he says should be taken particularly seriously. Like many other things, like many other people, fundamentally he's just an internet personality. He's just a performing monkey, basically, who's there to mislead people, particularly younger Americans who might be turning anti-Zionist. He's there to shove them down a reactionary dead end, basically. What's your opinion on the Cyclone project in the UK? Says Abolish NATO. Haven't watched any of it, so can't offer an opinion. When I've watched something of it, I will offer an opinion. In it for fun / slumbering colossus says Chavez also died under mysterious circumstances. Well, there is a lot of allegations floating around that, like, the US, delivered poison into his system, which ultimately killed him. I don't know. Again, put nothing past them, basically. G-Man subbed and liked. Good man, if indeed you are a man. The Zhukov's boot says the French seem to hunger to have a new 1812. Well, that didn't work out particularly well for them the last time. I can't work out how anyone could imagine it would help them. Well, again, this is all bullshit and lying from the French. They don't have the capability to fight the Russians. The only way that they would ever get into Ukraine was if they were allowed in following some kind of peace settlement. And again, the Russians aren't going to agree to that, because all that would mean was that the war was for nothing. Again, what's going to end up happening is, because the Europeans keep insisting on this kind of shit, there's not going to be, I mean, Orban said recently that Ukraine could be some sort of neutral zone. Again, the Europeans and the British and large elements in the United States will not actually accept that. For them, it's victory or the death of Ukraine. So you'll end up with the death of Ukraine. You'll end up with the Russians taking loads of Ukrainian territory, certainly down to Odessa. Maybe even Kiev itself will have to be taken before the West admits the defeat, and maybe not even then. Sid Hatfield says many think that the origin of the AIDS virus lies in the 1978 series of hepatitis B vaccines circulated in the US, especially in New York, San Francisco, LA, Philadelphia, and several more cities. Well, I don't know. I'd not heard that theory before. I've heard other theories about the origins of the AIDS virus being man-made. Again, I would not put anything past certain elements in the US government. These are people who conducted brutal experiments on prisoners and inmates in insane asylums for many, many years. So doing mass poisoning of their own population, well, they poisoned the population with the crack wave, so why not a disease as well? I don't know, though, is the honest answer to that. I haven't heard that theory before, so I'd need to look into it. If you have any sources, I'm happy to look at them. As for communist Christmas, well, I'll try and find a way to do Christmas in a communist fashion, everybody. So be sure to keep up to date with any Christmas pictures that I'm posting. Right, okay. I will leave it there for this evening. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. It's been a great number of you certainly on X. We've had over 600 odd of you here. Dan McClave says, saw the Palestine-Scotland flag, immediately followed, comrade, on Twitch. Good man, a good man. Therein lies something which is guaranteed to wind up all the right people. So thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon, on Substack, and Buy Me a Coffee. I will be back on the Patreon stream tomorrow to answer questions and do some briefing on future programming there. Be back with you again for 2 episodes of Decline and Fall this week, including an interview with Gabriel Rockhill about his book on the Western Left. So be sure to join us for that one. But until next time, thank you everybody for joining in. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. And now here's a video outro.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весь летит во все концы. Вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
Продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди. Ленин такой молодой и юный, хотя впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.